Thank you. Thank you very much. And hello, everybody. And thank you very much for having me today. And it's really great pleasure to be here today and to present this topic. I will explain some moments during my presentation. But I would like to answer your questions, of course, if you will have, and all comments are very welcome. So business and human rights perspective in post-oligarchic societies, and first of all, what questions we are going to cover today? I'm going to talk about post-Soviet societies and actually post-oligarchic societies. Some of my colleagues from my region actually said to me that I'm very optimistic when I'm talking about post-oligarchic societies, because our region unfortunately still could be characterized as oligarchic societies, but we will discuss it today as well. But my focus of research, of study, is actually post-Soviet region, and I will tell a little bit about this region and actually how post-Soviet, how Soviet past still impacts on business and human rights developments in particular, and more broadly democratic and human rights and the rule of law developments in the region. The concept of power and democracy, and the issue of legitimacy will be covered as well, because I think that actually the concept of power is crucial when we discuss the topic of democracy, as when we are discussing about the role of state, but also when we are discussing the role of private actors, especially when we talk about corporate actors. The power of private actors, and actually how business and human rights framework correlates on this issue of the power of private actors. Oligarchic societies, what we understand when we talk about oligarchic societies and oligarchy in the post-Soviet region, business and human rights agenda in the post-Soviet region, and what current developments about oligarchization, and what is the role of business and human rights framework in this process of oligarchization. For us, one of the starting point of this talk is understanding of oligarchic society. So I would like to propose you to understand the oligarchic society is designed on the control of political power by the economic elite, the big producers, investors from the economy. As a result, public institutions transform their procedures to meet private corporate interests at the expense of public goals, cementing economic power and translated it into political power. We have more broad term, corporate capture, and corporate capture we will discuss today this term as well, and it's quite new discussion in business and human rights community, and I will be back to this term as well. But let's start from some key facts about USSR, about Soviet period of our history, and as I said before, how the Soviet past still impacts on the development of the region. So you can see actually the Soviet Union on the world map, and key facts about USSR are the following: that this country actually was based on communist ideology. It existed from 1922 to 1991, and actually I was born in this country in Ukraine, but Ukraine was part of USSR. This country was the largest country that ever existed. It covered more than 8.6 million square miles, and Soviet Union was made up of 15 republics, and all these republics now are independent states since 1991, and you can see the list of these countries. Some of these countries now are members of European Union. It's the most progressive countries in their democratic and human rights developments, Baltic countries, Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania. But also we have Ukraine, Moldova, Georgia, Armenia, Azerbaijan. These countries are members now of European European cooperation, and also Kazakhstan, Turkmenistan, Uzbekistan, Tajikistan, and Kyrgyzstan are considered, it's very common when they are considered as Central Asian countries, and they have very strong links between them. And also Belarus, it's and Russia. These countries now are not part of any cooperation because of the Russian full-scale aggression against Ukraine. And it's important for us to know that actually in USSR, Communist Party leaders actually they controlled all parts of life in the country, and the freedom of expression, the freedom political freedoms were extremely limited, and also economic freedoms were limited significantly, and in particular private business was banned totally, and it was actually a criminal crime to provide private business, and all economy was controlled by the state, and we had administrative governed economy, central governed economy. And also the part of ideology was the confrontation between capitalism and socialism, and it was important part actually of the Soviet ideology to provide I would say propaganda about that capitalism violates human rights, and socialism provides protection of human rights, and actually only socialism which is provided by the Soviet Union could guarantee well-being of humanity. Nowadays, as I said before, we have 15 independent countries which were countries of Soviet Union, and also Soviet Union had a really significant impact on so-called Eastern Bloc countries. This is a group of Eastern European countries that were aligned militarily, politically, economically, and culturally with the Soviet Union, Albania, Bulgaria, Czechoslovakia, and now this is two countries, Czech Republic and Slovak Republic, East Germany, Hungary, Poland, Romania, and Yugoslavia, and you know that former Yugoslavia, and now it's Bosnia and Herzegovina, Kosovo, Montenegro, Serbia, North Macedonia, Croatia, and Slovenia. And some of these countries from this list, you of course know, are members of the European Union. Some of these countries are not members of European Union, and it's interesting to see how this Soviet past could be a good impact on developments of these countries today, and how some of these countries and what factors helped to some of these countries to improve their political, legal systems, and why some of countries with almost the same starting positions still could not make progress enough. And actually, it's interesting to see that if we take the key indexes, rule of law indexes, human rights, democratic developments indexes, we could see actually that, again, this so-called post-Soviet region in many cases is characterized by the same characteristics, and actually, as we start from this map of the Soviet Union, we can see almost the same picture in many cases, almost the same picture when we're talking about the rule of law developments, democratic developments, human rights developments, economic freedom developments. Just as example, the World Justice Project's Rule of Law Index from 2022, you see that this yellow and dark yellow colors mean actually that rule of law is not well developed in these territories. Next one, corruption perception index, and also we see that this region is characterized with quite low actually quite low characteristics. Freedom House rating and Freedom House characterize countries from the former Soviet Union. Many countries are characterized as not free. Some of countries, in particular, you see Ukraine partly free, and actually any of these countries from 15 former Soviet Union countries, any of them characterized as free. Index of economic freedom, again, 2023, and we see actually that there is still a little of progress. Ukraine was not characterized because of the war, but still we see this picture. So actually, this is the current situation, and my hypothesis is that all countries of this region are still under very strong impact of oligarch economies, and actually this my presumption will be covered today during our talk, and what factors actually impact on these developments, and how business and human rights agenda could be a solution of this problem, and in opposite way, how oligarchic society actually creates barriers for business and human rights developments in this region. But I would like to start from the concept of power and actually what is the role of the concept of legitimacy for our understanding of democracy, and what is the impact of the rule of law to ensure legitimacy in the democratic society. So actually the concept of legitimacy must explain why it is, if we are all fundamentally equal, that some of us should have the power to make, apply and enforce laws on the rest of us. And power can be legitimate if people trust to power and believe in the authority. And actually, I support the social contract theory, and I would like to base all my further explanation on this theory. And a social contract is a covenant by the people and the sovereign, in which the people forfeit their powers and rights, recognize the sovereigns to employ power over them. And when we are talking about power, we use very often the term of influence. And it's interesting that when we are talking about business and human rights and business business's impact on democracy, and I already used this term, we talk very often about impact, and actually the term of impact is used in the formal framework on business and human rights, UN guiding principles on business and human rights, we will be back to the UN guiding principles on business and human rights as well. So actually, it's interesting that the concept of power has long been known to be actually problematic concept, especially for the social sciences, because we already actually all of us use this term very often, and it seems that all of us understand this term, but when we are trying to explain what actually means this term, actually it's quite problematic for us. And that's why some of researchers are proposing to use bicycle concept. It means that everyone who can bicycle actually can do it, but when it should be explained how to do it, it could be very, very problematic. So the concept of power is it seems to be something like this bicycle concept, that it's hard to explain what it means exactly. When we are talking about corporate actors, we also talk about their impact as actually also actors which have power in society, and this power actually is based on that fact that corporate actors have opportunity to impact on people's lives, on community, on economy developments, and even on future generations. And we have a lot of examples of such impacts, and they are not equal equal participants of social relationships. So when we are talking about labor relationships and relationships between employer and employees, when we are talking about ordinary market relationships and about producer and client, when we are talking about just ordinary business activities which could impact future generations. In all of these cases, business actually has opportunity to impact significantly to very different aspects of our lives. And actually, it's very important for us to have instruments to be protected from the negative impact, and to be sure that actually we can be protected and we can have also impact on a business behavior and so on and so forth. And that's why we have this we see these parallels between actually power of the state, which is the classic relationships and classic understanding of the power, quite common for us, and power of businesses, because this significant role of businesses in our ordinary life. And actually, it was the starting point of development of business and human rights framework, that corporations not only have the ability to substitute government action, they also have the power to influence governments. Often we see this power used in negative ways through lobbying to improve their own terms of operation, but their power can be turned to positive uses as well, and applying pressure to repressive governments in particular. And ruling out a corporate duty to do so would entail leaving citizens of autocratic states to their fate when a better fate is possible. And while traditionally companies have not been regarded as direct responsibility bearers in regard to human rights, the UN framework on business and human rights establishes a responsibility to respect human rights also for corporations. And as I already said, the key point to do so was the fact that corporate actors have the power to impact on human rights and on ordinary lives of people. And as we expect this, the legitimacy of state power, today we also expect the legitimacy of the power of business actors. At the same time, it doesn't mean that we are trying to replace the state role to regulate social relationships, social life. The state, of course, is still considered as a key actor to regulate social life, but at the same time, we see that in many cases, actually, in many cases, business beyond of state impact. It could be many reasons why we have this situation. It could be the weak state, it could be the weak rule of law in the state, it could be undemocratic state, and business could cooperate with such an undemocratic state, and they could act in cooperation, and they could violate human rights and just in their interest, and many other cases, and also we have some space which is not under the state control. For example, the state control could be very, very limited in social media and so on. And so all these factors, very, very different factors, actually cause the situation that society expects that we will have opportunity and we will have instruments for legitimization of the power of corporate actors. But in societies which are characterized as oligarchic societies, of course, it's not possible to expect for such legitimacy, because actually oligarchic societies, you understand that they are controlled by such corporate actors, and such actors don't actually don't need to be legitimized. And I really don't actually know if today audience is aware with the UN guiding principles on business and human rights, and just in the case if the UN guiding principles on business and human rights is quite a new topic for you, I just explained briefly that the UN guiding principles on business and human rights were adopted in 2011. Elisa?
From the audience, and we do have some background on, thank you, on the UN guiding principles. I'm taking the questions from the audience. Yes.
Okay, okay.
I will repeat it.
Okay, so like in the previous slide, it were told that we should like empower the corporations to increase the respect of human rights in countries where they are not like they are persecuted. But we in the Western world, we always blame when a company increases its power beyond the state control. But in this case, we should like prioritize and favor if a company in a foreign state increase its power for like a right thing, because human rights, this is a topic that if it was not the case, we were not here. No, but how can you coincide the fact of empowering the corporations that we blame in the Western world when they take so much power?
So do you need me to repeat, Olena?
No. I heard perfectly, and thank you very much for this question. And actually, yeah, it's very interesting question, because I would say actually that my opinion that economic actors are very important and played a very important role from very beginning when Western democracy just were developed. I mean that if we be back to the history of the Western democracy, I mean the modern concepts of Western democracy and human rights developments, we could see that actually economic actors played this very important role, because they were fighting with the absolute state power to have some economic freedoms, first of all, and to be protected from the state authority and the absolute state authority, and to put some restrictions for the state power and so on. And actually, it's very important to have this balance and between economic actors and the state, and when these actors could have this something like not fighting, of course, for the interests, but when economic actors could somehow control state, and when state takes a lot for itself to regulate some spheres of society which should be, for example, self-regulated and so on, or when states restrict very much some freedoms, economic actors could react, and it's actually very important for Western world, and that we have Western world has economic actors is quite influential actors in whole society life, but in the rest of the world, I would prefer not talk about all other world, but I can say about my region, Eastern Europe and Central Asia region. We didn't have economic actors as actually actors of our public life at all. So we had a situation when we have the state, and state could regulate all aspects of our life, and we didn't have civil society, we didn't have economic actors, and actually we didn't have, we just had family relationships, very private relationships, which actually were also controlled in somehow by the state, and that's all, and anything else. And that's why now when since 1991, when we received this chance to have some balance in our public life, when we have civil society, when we have economic actors, and when we have state actors, we are trying to build something which will be balanced. And we don't want to have again a lot of state power. At the same time, because of this, we have another very negative situation when some economic actors became so powerful, and they are doing in correlation, in very strong correlation with, again, with the state. And as a result, we didn't receive really economic actors which can protect society from absolute state power. We received economic actors which are doing together with the state. But the idea is that economic actors could be a guarantee of democracy as well, if they are doing in a responsible way, and if they are trying to control the state as well, and to limit the absolute state power. But I think that the problem is not problem,
Olena,
but
just 1 second. I mean, we have a counter question.
It could also be like the other way around, because firms may also like help to keep the power in charge. We have here in Europe a statement in Ansel Latin that says pecunia non olet. So like as corporates can empower human rights, they can also be the other way around in keeping the regime afloat, like all the Western countries did affairs with the Soviet Union for the 70 years that lasted the USSR. So like it depends on which side we see, because from one side it can empower human rights, but from the other side it can help to keep the power.
So if I may add to this discussion, I think what Olena is trying to say is that, you know, what we should strive to achieve is a balance, of course, between the state power and the economic power. Sometimes we see the economic power even if being even stronger, more predominant than the state power. Sometimes we have the state power much more predominant over the economic activities. And then there are cases in which clearly the state power and the economic power go together in a collusive way and to the detriment of citizens and interests of society at large. And so clearly, Olena here, I think, is, if I understand, is more saying, well, if we train companies in a way to respect human rights as they do business, they could actually, in cases where there are so many government gaps, or we have states that don't do the interests of the local population, then companies could, from the perspective of those countries, of course, then these companies could fill those gaps or help to achieve certain goals that the government has no interest in achieving or in protecting certain rights. So I agree, it's very debatable because you never know, and it's how do you train companies to do that, okay, in the first place? Why should companies, and that's a question for Olena, but I don't want to, I mean, if you, maybe you can go back to it later on as well. I mean, but basically, how do you make these companies behave in a way that they don't collude with the oligarchic governments and instead try to mitigate some of the downside effects of oligarchic elites might have on society? So yeah, I leave you to your talk. I mean, you may want to offer a very short and then move on with short answer and then move on with your talk, and then we can go back to it at the end if we have time.
Yeah. No, actually, to respond to this question in short way, it's not possible because it's one of the key question of the concept of business and human rights, actually, and we have a lot of debates around of these questions, and yeah, I would prefer to be back to this question when we have the discussion. And also, I should say that actually it's not two different alternatives, and we should choose one. I mean that actually we need to, of course, we need to work on democratization of our state power, state institutions, and we need to have strong instruments to ensure democratic principles in our state governmental institutions and so on, but it doesn't mean that we should step back from the idea that business could have positive influence in democratic developments, especially in that regions and in that countries which don't have democratic traditions or which don't have human rights capacities. And for example, I can say that from our experience in our region, in international companies, when they came to our region after collapse of USSR, international companies were somehow as providers of democratic values and human rights ideas, because they already had them, and they already were forced to meet all these requirements and the expectations from them, and the general level of understanding of democratic traditions and human rights values in the society in our region was lower than international companies had at that time, and that's why they actually impacted positively in the region in this sense. So and for example, not just the example of these last days, one of the country not in our region, Asian country, adopted the law against homosexual relationships, and the business and human rights community calls international companies which operate in this country just to make statements about human rights and about international standards on human rights, and just to show that their position that it's not acceptable to adopt such laws because such laws violate human rights. So it could be a positive impact on developments of human rights developments in concrete countries when we are talking about this balance of economic actors and state actors. But I would be happy to be back to this question. And also, I just want to mention briefly that the rule of law concept is also very important for us when we are talking about corporate actors and when we are talking about oligarchic societies, because the rule of law is traditionally considered as a concept which addresses some requirements to public actors, to state actors. But again, taking into consideration the impact that companies have today, and participants of our discussion today also mentioned already, it's crucially that corporate actors should be considered as addressee of the rule of law requirements as well. And just as an interesting fact, we started this talk today from the World of Justice Rule of Law Index, and my colleagues and me as well, we each time when World Justice Project publishes the rule of law indexes for the concrete year, we are wondering actually what is the progress or regress of the concrete country in this index and so on. And many people in the world are interested very much in the result of these indexes, but not so many people know in what indicators this index is based on. And if we will go to these concrete indicators, we can see that actually many of them are about the role of companies in our life. For example, this index proposes to consider the scenario that please assume that the Environmental Protection Authority in your country notifies an industrial plant that it is polluting a river beyond the legally permitted levels, and which of the following outcomes is most likely. And then you can consider what is the most common situation in your country and choose the relevant answer. For example, the company complies with the law, or the company bribes or influences the authorities to ignore the violation, or absolutely nothing happens, or no, you don't know what could happen. Or, for example, assume that as a result of an audit, a local government officer is found to be unlawfully issuing a government license for personal benefit, for example, to a construction company owned by a family member. And actually, there are some examples which also identify actually the role of companies in our life and the correlations between companies and their impact on the governmental authorities. And it's a very interesting examples just to show that this role of companies is also considered as factors of the rule of law situation in the country, of course. And I shared before the talk, the report of the UN Working Group on Business and Human Rights. It's actually their last report. It was published last year in July 2022, and this report is about corporate political engagement and responsible business conduct. And there are a lot of interesting findings there, a lot of interesting sources, and the key term which is used by this report is corporate capture. And corporate capture is business political activities to influence the political and regulatory sphere where business engage political processes in support of policies that are inconsistent with respect for human rights. And there are a lot of dimensions of corporate capture, but I would say that the most risky and the most influential type of corporate capture is, of course, oligarchy. I just want to mention that in this report, the links between corporate political engagement and corruption are mentioned several times with special attention, and this is also very important feature when we are talking about the oligarchic societies. And my talk today is also based on the scope and study the status of the implementation of the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights in Eastern Europe and Central Asia. I am one of the authors of this study. It was published just a few days ago, but we worked on this study since 2021, and last year we also updated it because of the impact of the war in Ukraine and how the war impacts on the region and on the business and human rights agenda in the region. Among the key findings of this study, we in particular mentioned that the oligarchic structure of the economy in many countries in the region actually impacts very much on the situation of implementation of business and human rights agenda, and more generally on human rights situation in the region. And oligarchs actually are not just prominent business people in our countries with significant economic assets. They also enjoy strong political connections and have been able to control or influence state bodies, including law enforcement and other mechanisms of control. They are interested in low level of transparency, limited accountability, and the weak rule of law. And at this moment, we can be back to the start of our discussion today, and just to remind you these maps with the rule of law index, corruption index, economic freedom index, and so on and so forth. And the key reason of this situation actually is because of these strong connections between oligarchs and state authorities in our countries. All other business and human rights developments in our countries could be explained, or I would say non-developments could be explained by this situation. Civil society actually is not very interested to be involved on monitoring of business activities and business impact on human rights, partly because our this post-Soviet heritage that civil society actually is considering the state authorities as key factors of negative impact on human rights and political and civil rights. The key interests of civil society organizations. And actually, it's very interesting that in the Western Europe, it's a very common situation when people go to protests because of economic, social reasons. But in my region, it's very, it's very uncommon when people go to protests because of economic and social reasons. All protests in my region are about political rights, and it's also interesting difference between our regions because we still have this feeling about importance of political rights and importance to be protected from the state influence, but we don't have tradition to actually to pay attention on business behavior, and we don't so sensitive related to economic and social rights, despite to the fact that the level of social and economic protection in our region is much more lower than in the Western Europe. We have very weak trade unions, also because of this strong impact of oligarchs on the developments in our countries, and so on. A lack of trust in human rights mechanisms. Very common situation in our countries that states are trying to deregulate different sectors of economy and to be business friendly and to lower guarantees for employees for making doing business easily, and so on. We have a lack of political will to implement the UN guiding principles and lack of policy coherence. And at the same time, we have very strong representation of state-owned enterprises in our economies, and in many cases, the state-owned enterprises are controlled again by oligarchs, people who are very close to political power. We have a lack of decent jobs and social security, lack of transparency and human rights capacities of key actors, deficient access to judicial remedies for business-related human rights abuses, and actually in general, the judicial system in many countries of the region is still very, very weak, and actually the European Union Union when it is considering the issue of the integration of countries of the region, in particular Moldova and Ukraine, into European Union. One of the key questions to our governments is about the judicial system, and there is need to make reforms in judicial system because we still have a very weak judicial system, and it's also one of the results of this oligarchic economy in our countries. Of course, we have different situation in different countries, but it's interesting that all these characteristics that I mentioned, they are common for all countries in different levels, but all countries could be characterized with these characteristics, and yeah, it's also interesting, and I had a lot of conversation during the past 3 years with my colleagues from different countries: Armenia, Azerbaijan, Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan. I visited many of these countries during last 3 years, and in all these countries, my colleagues in all these countries shared the same expressions about the impact of oligarchs on the development on human rights and democratic developments in our countries. And for example, this report, I can share with you the link to this report. It's in open access. It's about extractive industries in some countries of our region. It was developed by Business and Human Rights Resource Center in 2021. But one of the key findings of this report is also about the impact of oligarchs with strong business interests and how they impact on the government and how and about the barriers of business and human rights developments. Ukraine has a very interesting experience, but we are at the very beginning of this development. I'm almost done. It's a very, very final thoughts. Ukraine has very interesting development. Draft the law on the prevention of threats of national security associated with extensive influence of persons having significant economic and political weight in public life, oligarchs. So we officially has a law to prevent the impact of oligarchs on our political and economic life, and it's would be very interesting to see if it will be actually successful. If so, we can share with other post-Soviet countries this experience. Yeah, and just the last slide, the final slide, this is again the map, and this map again is very similar to the previous maps, but this map is about national action plans on business and human rights, and we see that just Ukraine and Georgia. Georgia is green, Ukraine is blue. Have some business and human rights developments. Georgia has the special chapter on business and human rights in their national strategy for human rights. Ukrainian government made official statements that we are going to develop a national action plan on business and human rights. Now Kazakhstan and Kyrgyzstan are going to develop, but it's still in the very very start. So, but you can see there are a lot of green countries, and European Union countries are almost all are green because they have national action plans on business and human rights. So it's also very interesting development in our regions. So I would be happy to have a discussion about all these things.